Hey everyone, welcome to our first video for Unit 3. This unit we're going to be covering populations. In this video we'll be covering Learning Objectives 3.2 to 3.5. We covered Learning Objective 3.1 in our first two units that was looking at specialist and generalist species and identifying differences between them. So we saw usually specialist species had an advantage in a habitat that was constant, whereas generalist species had advantages in habitats where a lot of environmental change could be occurring, or if they're an invasive species, for example, generalists tend to be able to adapt to the different environments they're coming into. So briefly, if we think back to the levels of ecological organization, we had our single individual. That single individual made up a population, which was a group of the same species living in one area at a certain time. Those populations in that area make up the community. So you've got your population of rabbits, trees, wolves. All of those combined are the community. Our ecosystem is going to take our community and add in our abiotic factors. So thinking about the flow of energy, flow of matter, all the cycles occurring. And then our biosphere is going to take all of our ecosystems and look at it at a global scale. So the biosphere really is the whole Earth. So this unit we're looking at population ecology. So we'll look at factors that are going to cause populations to increase or to decrease. There is 5 characteristics of a population. The first is size. This we represent with the capital letter N. So this is just a count of the individuals within a certain area at a certain time. Population density is the number of individuals per unit area. So when you see the word per, you want to think about a division sign. So we would take our number of individuals and divide by whatever our given area is. Population distribution is how the animals or the organisms are spread out, how they're distributed with respect to one another. Sex ratio is how many males to how many females in a population, and age structure is how many individuals fit into different age categories. So usually we can split populations up into pre-reproductive age, reproductive age, and post-reproductive age. So all of these apply to populations in the wild, but we'll also look at them with the human population later this unit. Population distribution, again, is describing the location of individuals, how they are spread out. This is often determined by the habitat patchiness, so how the resources are distributed is going to impact how the organisms are going to be distributed. Or it could be features of the organism. So if they're a very territorial animal, or in plants, if they have autotoxicity, which we'll talk about in a minute. But we can divide our populations distributions into either randomly, uniformly, or clumped patterns. So for random, there is kind of everyone for themselves. All the individuals are going to be independent. They won't be interacting with each other. This isn't very common in nature, but some examples are spiders, clams, some trees. So if you look here, we've got a few that are clumped together, some are more spread out. There isn't really any pattern in random distribution. In uniform, we have a very easily identifiable pattern. So it's not going to be exactly perfect, but it's pretty evenly spread out. This is typically going to be from intraspecific competition. So these organisms are going to be competing with each other. Interspecific competition, you'd have organisms competing with other species. So in this example, we've got cacti competing with each other for intraspecific. If it were inter, it'd be this cacti competing with one of the smaller bushes that's also in that picture. So these plants actually have autotoxicity, which means that they're able to release a chemical that's going to inhibit, it's going to stop plant seedlings of the same species from growing. So this one cacti will release chemical into the soil, and seedlings, even its own seedlings, aren't going to grow nearby. That's how you get such a uniform pattern. And our last distribution is clumped. This is the most common distribution in nature. You've got groups of animals that are clustered together, or groups of plants. And this is typically going to be around a resource such as food, a water supply, could be a shelter. So it's going to occur because of habitat differences, could be seasonal or daily changes in weather, it could be their reproductive patterns, or it could be their social behavior. Population density, we're looking at how many individuals per unit area. Low population densities, you're going to have individuals more spaced out. So these would be your territorial animals, a solitary mammal species such as a tiger, which isn't going to be interacting a lot with other tigers. And then for plants, it could be in a marginal environment. So if margin, you want to think about the edges, and edges typically have less resources. There's usually more disruption to that environment. So if there are fewer resources, you're going to have fewer organisms in that area. At high population densities, you've got organisms more crowded together. These are usually animals that grow in colonies, like rabbits, corals, which we have in this picture here, and termites. The factors that are going to impact population growth can either be density dependent or density independent. Density dependent factors have a greater effect on population when the density is higher. So if you have a larger, more dense population, there's going to be more competition for resources. It's going to be easier for predators and parasites to find that population versus if it was more spaced out. And infection and disease is going to spread more readily because if they're closer together, it'll be easier to pass those diseases around. So all of these factors are biotic. Your food supply, disease, parasites. Competition is a biotic factor as you're competing with other species. And predation is also going to be biotic as you have your prey and other species that you'd be interacting with. Density independent factors are going to impact the population no matter what the density is. So if the temperature or the precipitation, if any of these abiotic factors start to change, if it goes outside of that species range of tolerance, it's going to impact all of the organisms. Other examples would be catastrophic events. If there's a flood, all of the organisms would be impacted. It wouldn't matter if there were fewer organisms. They would all still be impacted by whatever the catastrophic event might be. When we look at how populations grow, typically a new population, a colonizing population, is going to experience exponential growth, and it's going to have this nice J-shaped growth curve here. This is only happening at the beginning of this population growth. It doesn't usually continue at an exponential rate. So as long as there's enough food, space, and other resources, the population is going to grow exponentially. But if there are limiting factors, or another term is environmental resistance, that would stop. It's going to inhibit the population from growing exponentially. So we have our lag phase. So it's growing. It's not growing very fast, but you're still adding individuals. And then eventually we will reach exponential growth where as long as there's enough resources, the population is going to just grow at a really fast rate. But that doesn't typically happen. You're going to have environmental resistance. You're going to have a lack of resources to support that large population size. So you have your exponential growth here, and eventually we're going to hit environmental resistance. So we've grown, but we don't have enough resources to support this large population size. So we'll have die-off occur. Some of the organisms will die off due to competition. They weren't able to get the resources, but too many organisms will die off. So we'll have a little bit more growth, and then we'll reach that same pattern. We have too many organisms, some will start to die off due to lack of resources. So you have what we call the S curve, which is this logistic curve here. And the average of this curve is the carrying capacity. And we represent that with the letter K. So that's the average number of organisms that this environment can support. What happens is we have overshoot, which we go over the carrying capacity, and then we have die off. So die off will start to decrease, we'll overshoot again, we'll die off, overshoot again, die off. Over time, the S curve is going to get smaller and smaller as it reaches closer to the average. We won't have quite so much overshoot and quite as much die off. There are two parameters that are going to impact the logistic growth of populations. So the intrinsic rate of natural increase, which is also called our biotic potential, this is the maximum reproductive rate of an organism. So if we think about the J curve, this is going to be the maximum reproductive rate of that organism. So this is symbolized by the letter R. The saturation density, or also called the carrying capacity, is represented by the letter K, and this is our other selection factor. So we can think about species falling as rather K-selected or R-selected species. R-selected species are opportunistic species. They include roaches, bacteria, rodents. They have usually exponential growth, but they're not going to reach K. So their population size is going to go up and down, but they don't really reach carrying capacity. So they have really quick development. They have a high birth rate. They reproduce early, and they usually reproduce once a year. These organisms don't have a very long lifespan. It's usually less than a year, and they have a very high productivity. So they're reproducing a lot and they have a lot of offspring. Our other selected species are K-selected, and these are more efficient organisms typically. They have fewer offspring with longer lives, but they're putting more effort into raising their offspring. So those offspring are more likely to survive. That's why they have fewer to begin with. So most large mammals, elephants, humans, birds of prey, these are going to be K-selected species. So there's slower development, usually larger, they're more competitive, they reproduce later in life, and our length of life as a K-selected species is typically longer than 1 year. So K-selected species population size tends to hover around our carrying capacity. We'll get to humans in a minute because we are a little bit different than other animal species, whereas we have not yet reached our carrying capacity. When we look at how species survive, we call those survivorship curves. And we can compare across because we're looking at the number of survivors per 1,000 individuals. So we're not going to look at all of the individuals in that population. We'll take it by 1,000 so we can compare them. So we have type 1, 2, and 3. In type 1, there is loss late in life. So these are usually your K-selected species. Most of the 1,000 are going to survive through their early life, but as they reach old age, you do start to have animals die off. So in your juvenile years and most of the adult life, most of these are going to survive. In type 2, it's a constant loss. It's usually due to predation and starvation. So really no age is impacted more than others. And in type 3, you have lots of early loss in life. So there's a lot of die-off. These are most of your R-selected species. So once you get to old age, mortality is lower, for those that are left.